Boom, ever onward tribe. I've told a story about this man before. I think if you haven't heard it, one of the great gifts of my career is that my first two leaders I worked for in the military, my first two commanding officers, were the best officer I ever worked for and the worst officer I ever worked for, which in many ways couldn't have been a greater gift. I knew exactly who I wanted to be, who I wanted to emulate, what type of leader I wanted to be, and equally important, I knew exactly who I didn't want to be. So that was a real gift. The one that I wanted to be, my teammates and I, the young guys at that new team, gave him the nickname or the moniker Father War. He is a community legend. Anyone that knows, as I tell these stories, that knows him, it'll bleed out who it is. I'll keep his name, to myself. But Father War was truly one of the greatest leaders I've ever worked for. The lessons I pull from my time with him can hardly be counted, but I'm going to share as many of them as I can because they've served me so well. When I was at my first command, this was pre 9/11. You would, right before your team or your, in that era, platoon was going to deploy overseas. So it's kind of pre-combat era. We're still doing really cool things in my team, Central and South America, counter-drug, counter-narcotic operations. You would do what's called an ORE back then, an operational readiness exercise. It's basically a bunch of war games that would take place over 3 to 5 days, and you're constantly getting hit and thrown curveballs and challenges put in front of you in all the myriad of skill sets we would need to be able to employ on the battlefield. It is a very intense week. You're constantly winning the day, you're failing. They put monkey wrenches into different systems, so you fail, they see how you respond. Very little sleep, you're getting after it. It's one of the true first times when you get through Hell Week in SEAL training, you're like, well, it'll never be worse than that. And then the instructor's like, that's why we do it. It will, and it does. But I remember my team was tasked with joint operations. So my senior leader, he went off to do some other operation. I was in charge of what was called an over the beach, OTB operation, to basically take boats ashore, sneak up onto what would be a foreign shore, get my assault team into a spot, prosecute a target, do a mission, and then come back out either undetected or get the job done successfully. Over the beach operations are bread and butter for SEAL teams. Very few units can actually come from the sea in that harsh environment to do those type of events. And one of the things you need to figure out as you're doing those missions is, let's say you're coming in at night, you might have to come in at some point at daytime. And this era was almost all at night. You had to figure out what distance you would use off the coast to get ashore undetected. And so my buddy and I, another sister platoon, he and I are young officers, brand new to the team. We're both in charge of running this mission. And we pick about a mile offshore to kind of launch our boat, start our what's called infill or heading into the target. And then we'd come ashore and do our job. Target, everything goes great. We have a great night. We come back, we're debriefing with Father War. We explain the mission. We kind of give him the X's and O's. And he said, great, what'd you learn? And my buddy and I kind of stared at each other. There's nothing worse than if a senior officer asks you something you don't really have an answer. And we sort of just repeated some of the basics of the mission. He's like, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. I want you to go do it again. But you were how far off the coast when you started? We said a mile. He's like, go 10 miles out. You're like, ooh. So now you got more gas, you got more things you need to deal with, higher seas, and you've got to launch from a farther distance to get ashore. We run the mission again. Only change was we go 10 miles out. We come in, we do the mission. Great success. We come back in. We're sitting in front of him. Both of us know we're going to get asked the question. Neither one of us have an answer. He said, what'd you learn now that you went further out? And we scratch our heads. We try and come up with something. He's like, nope, haven't figured it out yet. Double it. And we're like, sir? He said, 20 miles out. That's where you start the infill. Now we've got to use a different set of boats that can carry the smaller boats on top of them. So we've got to call a separate unit to come in with complexity, bring us part of the distance, then unload those boats, come ashore, do the job. Amidst that mission, I'm thinking to myself like, man, this was a lot easier at 10 miles and 1 mile. We get ashore, we get it done, we come back out, and then we're walking to his office, and something struck me in that moment as we did it. And I didn't share it with my buddy. I wasn't trying to, get huge accolades from Father War, but we sat down. He said, great, looks good. What'd you learn? I said, sir, I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but it was pretty obvious to me that, 1 mile, 10 miles, and 20 miles, obviously everything inside of 20 miles was so much easier, I couldn't believe it. I'm glad we went that far to do that drill so that I know anything with inside that distance is going to be a layup. It's going to be the easiest shot we could take. Big smile on his face. He said, okay, move on to air operations. You're done with Over the Beach. The thing that was cool about this moment is, one, I think I got the right answer, but two, is this idea of people ask why we push so hard in training, why the greatest fighters, competitors, athletes, thinkers work so hard to get good at their job. What you realize is, if whatever you're trying to achieve, if you push the threshold in training way beyond what you're going to need to do in the actual fight, everything within that fight gets easier. If you're a shooter, you practice shooting a rifle out to 1,000 yards. You might never need 1,000 yards in that shot. 500 and closer becomes the easiest shot you're ever going to take because you pushed it far. Make your training, make your discipline tough. Go further than you think you need to do. Then when you need it and it's inside that, everything's going to be easy. Ever onward.